Thank you to everybody. This has been a hugely rich day and utterly impossible to summarise, so I'm not going to try. I will just say a word about myself, why I'm here really. I'm an ethicist by development and trade. I've been involved with the Art AI programme at Bath for quite a number of years. But my day job until last year was here as director of the team that leads, guides, advises the Church of England on questions of ethics, politics, public engagement, and so on. So, as someone who has for many years tried to bridge the academy and the church, my tendency is to look at questions through finding the best research, the sharpest analysis, but then saying, so what do we do? And so I thought I'd try to bring this conference to a close by focusing a little on what do we now do as communities of faith, people of faith. I think in the course of today, one thing I would have valued hearing a little more about, although it was present, is the tremendous potential of AI to do good. That in medicine, in the pursuit of compassion, in the pursuit of healing. Some work I did with colleagues at Bath a while ago on AI on the battlefield showed how properly applied AI applications on the battlefield can minimize collateral damage if that's what you ask it to do. So the benefits of AI for the things which people of faith want to see and want to stand for shouldn't be neglected. But I've always thought that the questions of ethics, which have been at the heart of what we've been talking about today, for a religious tradition of ethics, ethics as a discipline lies somewhere between doctrine and practice. We start with the difference it makes when you factor in the beliefs of the community, the belief in God, the concept that if there is a deity, and it's a deity like this, how does it affect our judgments about the world, and how does it affect how we live in the world? And so it's a bridge discipline in itself. And I think the study of ethics has sometimes lost that sense of its roots in what we believe. And sometimes it's got so caught up in what we should believe that it's forgotten about the practice and the application. So I hope that our ongoing debates about the role of faith and religion in ethics and AI keeps those that spread in mind. So looking first at perhaps the more doctrinal end, what do we believe in that touches on this debate? I can't cover the whole ground, of course. A lot of it has come up today. Early on, we heard something about truth and how difficult it becomes to distinguish what is true. And I think that the belief in certainly a monotheism, a belief in God, commits us to the notion that there is such a thing as objective truth, even though we don't grasp it in its totality. And again, there are lots of resources in our traditions we can draw on here. I think of one which comes to me from Charles Taylor's work, where he draws a clear distinction between an ontological position and an advocacy position. An ontological position is a statement of what is the case. An advocacy position is a statement of what the speaker wants you to believe is the case. It seemed to me that some of the conversation about the singularity is almost upon us, resistance is futile, needs to be clearly categorized as an advocacy position and not an ontological position. And the same goes for a lot of the discourse that we're encountering, not from those perhaps who are most seriously engaged in AI, but from those who have a great deal to gain from causing us to believe that certain things are inevitable and indeed that resistance is futile. Because part of the religious mindset, I think, is a very strong connection to the concept of resistance to some of the things of the world that are destructive, particularly destructive of our humanity. We need other tools as well as that to help us build our resilience in the pursuit of truth. There's been a lot today about being human. That's almost been the theme. But I do believe that, and I perhaps only speak for the Christian churches or even only for the Church of England here, it's time to raise our game here. It's time to do more work on the nature of being human, because I think we've allowed our understanding of our humanity to elide into something that's probably more fundamentally secular and perhaps quite sloppy. We need to say very, very clearly, do we not, from our different traditions, that intelligence is not the unique property of humans, and that you can be human and unintelligent, that even the person with persistent vegetative syndrome is human. And I think that in popular public discourse, that's largely gone. And I think that is a particular problem for Christians, because in the West anyway, and certainly in England, the way in which Christian ethics is really embedded in our popular discourse without us knowing that it's there has led to a certain casualness that thinks that Christian ethics is basically the same as common sense, and that a lot of debates in our synod, for instance, could be actually summed up as, well, I read the Daily Mail and it said this, and I read the Guardian and it said that. It's not like that, our nature of our humanity and what it is to be intelligent, we shouldn't take so much for granted. I wonder if we are more frightened than we should be about AI, more anxious, because we have allowed ourselves to believe that intelligence is the one thing that distinguishes us from other parts of the creation. And I just think that is heresy, perhaps not just for Christians. We've talked a lot about the things that really make us human. We talked about embodiment. I'm minded of a really rather important piece of writing a few years ago by Rowan Williams about how it is our embodiment that makes sense of the concept of human rights. That we don't just have human rights because we're human. That's a circular argument. We have human rights because we are embodied. We are thus fragile, another word that came up today. We can be annihilated. But it's our embodiment that makes us human. It's our capacity for joy. It's our capacity for love and being loved. Love is actually rather interesting because its relationship to rationality is at least tenuous. Ask Shakespeare. And of course, it's when we mistake transactional relationships for love that we are most vulnerable to falling into abusive contexts. And so much of how we articulate relationship is now transactional. The former economics editor of The Guardian, Larry Elliott, once said that economics as a discipline has had a nasty dose of physics. And what he meant was we should see economics less as it sees itself now as a predictive science and more as part of the humanities, as the study of how people actually behave. I wonder if in some of our notions of consciousness, of personhood, rationality, as they pertain to the debate on AI, we have had a nasty dose of maths, that we have made a category error in thinking that our rationality can be reduced to processes and not so much as seeing it as a study of how people actually behave, where rationality isn't quite the same kind of ideal. And of course, many of the problematic areas of AI are not technological at all, they're political, they're cultural. Caring for how human beings are enabled to transition in times of rapid technological and industrial change is something that not many cultures have got right in several hundred years. Isn't it weird that we've not learnt much from our failures in previous industrial revolutions? But those are political and cultural questions. We do know a fair bit from economics about the need to do something that isn't just trusting the market. And Keynes has just been mentioned. Let me excite you with some more Keynes. When Keynes said famously, in the long run, we're all dead, what he actually meant was the economic cycle does indeed right itself. Prosperity will return after a slump. Unfortunately, people don't work on that timescale. They starve in that timescale of recovery. So simply saying, oh, it'll turn, the cycle will return, is not a human response. So simply trusting that we will find the technology to ameliorate the condition of those who have been impoverished and made redundant as human beings by technological change is not good enough. We know how to put the brakes on. People talked about slowing down in the context of Shabbat. We know how to put the brakes on some things until the moral argument has been had. We know that in medicine. We don't stop the research, unless it threatens to be unethical in itself. We can stop the application of it, and we have mechanisms to do that until we have discussed socially and culturally the impact of doing that. And that's against the onslaught of those who believe that if we can, we must. And we know how to stand up to that in some contexts. Do we know how to stand up to it in the context of the rather more commercialized and powerful, economically powerful world of AI? But what are we to do as people of faith and as faith communities? I think the first thing is very simple. We act as good citizens because we are that as well as people of faith. And that's harder than it sounds. We've been told by no lesser an authority than Esther Ranson recently, in the context of the assisted suicide debate, that arguments by religious people are not legitimate in the public sphere. Because clearly we believe things that the whole population doesn't, or at least Esther Ranson doesn't. That has to be pushed back on tremendously hard. My good friend Nick Spencer at Theos has been writing recently on the nature of a religious argument, which is not just an internal discourse for those who like that sort of thing. It's about how everybody comes from somewhere in terms of their worldview and their values and what they believe to be the good. And we need to assert that as citizens. And if, as citizens through our religious organisation, we have a seat in Parliament, then good for you. Let's do it. Let's use the things we have to make our arguments stick. But once we admit the possibility of a deity into our ethics, even if other people come to the same conclusions, we still need to keep that connection. Professor Nigel Biggar made the point many years ago that we spend so much time in our religious communities wanting to be distinctive. The thing we ought to be holding out for is authenticity. Our arguments are not only Christian or Jewish or Muslim because only Christians, Jews and Muslims can say that. They can be shared by people coming from all other starting points, but we need to know that our arguments are authentic to our tradition. That's how ethics sits between doctrine and practice. So let's look to our doctrines. Let's start with the idea of power being given away, which came up fascinatingly, not from Christians for whom that should be so central. And yet look how, in the growing power of a rather toxic Christian nationalism in the West now, that doctrine is simply ignored or stood on its head. We have a fight to get our doctrines accepted by our own organizations, our own churches, our own so-called fellow believers. And look how much of the debate about AI and about so many other important things is being carried on by those who have and are used to exercising agency. No wonder we have a political crisis when our overall political discourse is articulated from the point of view of people with agency for whom choice is always promise and never threat. And how can we have a serious debate about both the promise and the threat of AI if the voices of those who lack agency, whose experience of life is being done unto rather than choosing to do, if those voices are not in the room? And who better than faith communities to bring that kind of diversity to the table? Well, actually, we're not that good at it, but surely we have more potential than many such communities. So I look to the concrete manifestations of faith, not just the doctrines, not just the academics, but the physical presence of our churches, our mosques, and our synagogues. places in an era when place is apparently becoming less and less relevant, places where people gather, and again, ideally, or as part of the self-image we have, people who have not just chosen each other, but have been chosen to be together by their commitment to place. Now that's something already being eroded, I don't know about among Jews and Muslims, but certainly among Christians, who increasingly worship with people like them and will travel past the doors of several churches to do so. I think we need to reaffirm the idea of the Christian or perhaps Jewish or Muslim community as the people of that place who have not chosen each other, but have in a sense been chosen to be together to do something that they may regard as totally ordinary and beyond question, because often they've grown up with it, but which actually is weird. When else do we sit in rows? When else do we listen attentively, other than the occasional trip to the theatre? When else do we sing together? I think people of faith need to be reminded sometimes that this is deeply countercultural stuff, and it's there for a purpose. It's there to create community, and community is, I believe, schooling in virtue, as we learn what it is to live for one another. This comes down, I think, to a fundamental doctrinal point, the difference between covenant and contract. Covenant, coming from the Hebrew scriptures, I will be your God and you will be my people. Not, I'll be your God provided you're good. Not, we will accept you as your God provided you give us what we ask for. But being for another. I've often wondered how you can build the concept, it came up earlier, Catholic social teaching, the concept of supererogation. How do you build that into an algorithm? Supererogation is something which nobody can be required to do. A kid falls into a river. Nobody's required to jump in and pull them out. But if someone doesn't, we are deficient as people, as a people. How do you build that into an algorithm when it's something that cannot be demanded of anybody? Do you lose it if it's not built into the AI applications that we become used to using for thinking ethically? That sort of thing comes out of a group of people committed to being there for one another. Sacrificial living, you might call it. You might call it power exercised most strongly and authentically when it's given away. The other thing we do, of course, or should do, and again, in many of our churches don't do, is talk about death and finitude. That's a fundamental calling, it seems to me, of our faith communities. And yet, is death only seen as failure when you reduce our ethical thinking to transactional and impersonal relationships? How do you deal with encountering a chatbot as if it were a person when it can't share your ultimate mortality and therefore can't perhaps even be programmed to empathize with that, which is somewhere deep within us, even when we don't talk about it or acknowledge it? It's to do with our embodiedness and our vulnerability. At the end of the day, it is the end of the day, so I'll shut up. At the end of the day, I think that the most important thing is to realize how we are different from the kind of intelligence which artificial intelligence is at present majoring upon, even when it can produce rather an effective simulacrum of our intelligence. And so I thought I'd end with a quote from a book by one of our Bath colleagues, Nello Christianini, which I found a really helpful quote. And it's about intelligence. Nello says, "Intelligence is not about being human, but about being able to behave effectively in new situations. This ability does not require a brain. We can find it also in plants, ant colonies, and software. Different agents can display this ability to different extents in different tasks. There is not a single general way to be intelligent, nor a secret formula or a single test. It is misleading to attribute human qualities to all intelligent agents. And when reflecting on the intelligences we encounter in our browsers, we would do better by comparing them with the snails and herbs in our garden, rather than with us. And that, for me, puts the questions of AI very firmly within our ethical reflections on the nature of the creation, and distances us sufficiently to perhaps alleviate us of some perhaps unnecessary anxiety about tech, as opposed to our legitimate anxiety, in my view, about the politics and culture that are selling us something that perhaps is not properly controlled. Thank you.